Hi, doodads and dudettes. This is a prequel video for my AppleTalk series.
Say, kids, what time is it?
It's 8-bit doodads time!
On the screen, you see the pictures of the first Macintosh, what was called the Fit Mac or the Mac 128. It only had 128K of memory. It ran, they didn't even call it Mac OS at the time. It ran Finder and System. What was interesting about this machine was the choices they made when developing it and why they made those choices, which led to the coming about of AppleTalk. If you look at the back of the machine, on the bottom, you'll notice there's 4 ports. One of them was for a mouse, and at the time they used a DB9 connector for the original Mac. And then on the front of the machine, you'll see there was a telephone style connector for the keyboard. The only other ports on the back was a disk drive port for plugging in a second disk drive and 2 what looked like DB9 serial ports. But Apple made an interesting decision when they were making the machine. Instead of using a standard serial UART, which would have been typical in a lot of PCs, they actually used an upgraded SCC chip that made it not just be able to do serial, but what was RS-422 at the time, which was a enhanced serial, or could be faster serial. And you'll see there are 2 ports there, one for a modem, one for a printer, which in their default mode would allow you to plug into an external modem. 300, 1200 baud would have been the standard at the time of the Mac. And the printer port could plug into an image writer. Apple chose this chip and that protocol not because of the higher speed, well, maybe because of the higher speed, but something else they were intending. This is pre-USB days. So, there was no USB port to plug all your peripherals into. And as you know, with the Macintosh, there's basically 2 boards in that machine. There's a motherboard and there's a video board that's driving the screen. And so expansion was very limited. This was actually intentional. Steve Jobs didn't believe slots were expensive and they were, would add to the overall price. And this machine was already $2,500 when it came out. So it's quite expensive. And they designed these ports to be their expansion bus. In fact, they called it the Apple bus at one time. And it's because they were using RS-422, they could drive these ports at a higher speed than just serial. They could do more than printers. And what they had imagined was that these ports would become something that you could daisy chain devices off of and be a way to expand the capabilities of the Mac. One of those would have been to plug into a printer, but they foresee, storage options or a MIDI interface or other things could be hung off these ports. At the time they were developing this Mac, they were also developing the first laser writer. It wasn't done yet, but they looked at this as a way to connect to that. What happened later was they figured out, okay, we can use that idea of chaining devices, but instead of chaining devices, they could chain computers and have those computers share devices. And that's where AppleTalk came in. And in fact, on the subsequent versions of the Mac, they went from the DB9 to the little DIN8s, and they created, when they released the laser writer, the first AppleTalk network, which all you needed was a $35 to $50 retail Apple adapter that would plug into this, and using cables could chain multiple Macs together. And the laser writer had one of those ports, and it could be chained as well. A big reason for this was not only being able to share that very expensive printer, but also the way they designed this, the network stack on the Mac was only 6K to support AppleTalk. Given that the machine, this first generation machine only had 128K, having a network stack that's only 6K, and if any of you have used the original, had an IBM DOS machine and you were connecting to Novell networks and everything else, you know those network stacks were taking 50, 60, 70K. So this was critical to them at the time. When they originally launched AppleTalk or talked about AppleTalk, not only did they talk about connecting the machines together and sharing that printer, they had envisioned a dedicated Apple Share server that would share files and give more storage to all these machines. They abandoned that original, which was going to be a dedicated machine, which was going to be called Macintosh Office, and they since were able to, if you had a Mac with a hard drive attached to it, it could share that hard drive with all those machines. So that was a way to share documents. It was a way to share software. And you would also, if you had a printer associated with those machines on that network, you could share that printer. The original AppleTalk spec was a little bit limited. You could only have 32 computers connected to it. And just like IP networks, there is a whole, how do I address one machine over another? How do they talk to each other? That was part of their great sauce, is that the network automatically tuned when you plugged in a new Mac. It figured out, okay, new address that isn't being used by anybody else, and could talk to each other. They later expanded this because 32 machines might not have been a lot for businesses. And so they started creating things like zones, where you could have a cluster of machines that was in one zone and another cluster in another zone, and you could bridge the zones using what they called at the time an AppleTalk router. Not the same thing as what we think of as a router, but it was a way to bridge networks together. The key selling feature for them was the simplicity of it, is that when you had machines with AppleTalk, you just had to plug in one of those dongles. The AppleTalk dongle, or as I'll be showing you in some of my later videos, a PhoneNet dongle that plugs in. You plug it in the back of the machine, you wire it to the next machines. If you have 5, 6 machines set up together, you could unplug one of the connectors going from one machine to another, drop a new machine in there with another connector, and put it in the middle, and you've just added a machine to the network. The user didn't have to do anything. And in fact, the only thing they had to do on the new machine was go into the control panel, choose they wanted to turn on AppleTalk, put in their machine's name just so it could be identified, and they were on the network. It was the Mac simplistic way of automatically configuring a network. And the cost adding the machine was that connector kit, which was only $50. And at the time, an Ethernet board or a gateway network board or token rings, they might be anywhere from $350 to $1,000 to join those machines on a network. And here was a way to join machines for $50. It was quite an advantage to them. They didn't actually make more things that could talk off of that port. They never turned it into the storage mecca. One of the problems was, out of the box, the ports on these machines were limited on how fast they could go. Built into the machine, based on timing and the circuitry in the chips, they could only do about 230 kilobits of transfer, which is plenty for doing printing. It's not so great for file sharing. The way the Mac was designed and the other machines were designed that use this RS-422 is if you didn't use the clocking signals that were built in inherent in the machine, and you actually had an external box that controlled it, you could make it go faster. And in fact, there were a couple people who went that route that tried to improve the speeds between machines. And in fact, there's some PC AppleTalk cards that several people made that in a normal AppleTalk environment could only speak to 230K, but because they could have the faster timing on them, if you had cards in multiple PCs, they could talk to each other at a much higher rate. In fact, Topps Network, which came out a year or two after the Mac, they started making cards for PCs and for sharing files and for working with the Macs, and they could do the higher speeds. At the time that I got the first Mac, I was working for a college, and we had bought a bunch of Apple IIe's to do a computer lab. And the day we were finalizing the purchase, they had come out, just before that, they'd come out with the Macintosh, and it went on what we call the state contract list. I mean, it was an approved purchase at a set price. And we grabbed one of these original Macintoshes. The reason we got one Macintosh and 30 apples is each apple was with a disk drive and a monitor and everything else was $800 or $900 on our 50% off discount state price. And the Mac at $2,500 still costs us like $1,600 or $1,700 with only 128K memory. But we had one for the lab. The reason I bring this up is there was one device that I came across that actually used that higher speed on the Mac in those ports. And that's because that Apple Lab, we deployed a Corvus network that connected all the machines together. And Corvus had made they were in beta. They had manufactured a device to get the Macs onto the Corvus network, and it was an external box that plugged into their normal network and used that port, but they could drive the port at a higher speed because the box could do the higher clocking signals. That's the only device that I've ever personally come across that uses the higher speed on those ports. I hope you find this history interesting. If you liked it, please click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for our follow-up videos on AppleTalk. And we're going to work through Macs, Apple IIs, PCs, printing and sharing files, and even connecting up to Ethernet networks and newer Macintoshes and even Raspberry Pis.